Airlines Confidential with Scott McCartney is made possible with support from Pratt & Whitney, committed to working smarter, cleaner, and greener today for a more sustainable tomorrow. PrattWhitney.com. Infinity Flight, the leader in Cadet Academy flight training programs. InfinityFlight.com. Ontario International Airport in Southern California. SoCal So Easy. And by Cirium, the world's most trusted source of aviation analytics, Cirium.com. We also welcome your business's support. Contact us at airlinesconfidential.com.
Welcome to Airlines Confidential. I'm Scott McCartney, and there's no shutdown here. Airlines Confidential is up and running, even if most of the government isn't. And it's a good thing, too, because we have a very, very special show planned this week. Doug Parker is back, and Richard Anderson is back. Doug was the CEO of his airlines for 20 years. Richard was the CEO of his, Northwest and Delta, for 9 years. They competed against each other, often fiercely. They worked together to keep the industry afloat after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. The two of them did more than anyone to shape the airline industry for the first 20 years of the century and get it to sound financial footing for the first extended period ever since deregulation. So it is a real treat for me, and I think a real treat for listeners to hear them together. Doug, you made this happen. I can't wait.
Yeah, me either. I've known Richard a long time. We've been competitors, but also friends, and he's done amazing things for our business, so I'm looking forward to talking to him about it.
Absolutely. All right. So we'll go through a few news things quickly and get to the conversation with Richard. I know you had mentioned to me it's been a year since Elliott Management bought a stake in Southwest Airlines and started pushing for all kinds of change. So what do you think after a year in?
Well, I don't know. I'm more interested in how they think. And what they feel about it. I don't know. Again, where Southwest would be right now if it weren't for Elliott's input over the last year or so. But what I did do, my easy analysis, which is not perfect by any means, but just look at the stock price a year ago to today. And again, that's not what they bought in at, but one of our listeners can do this much better than I did. This is very easy to go to on my own iPhone, though. Just look at stocks 1 year ago to today versus today. It's a pretty good proxy, I'm sure, for how Elliott's done. And if you do that, Southwest stock is up 4% over the last year. The S&P 500 is up 17%.
Right. Airlines
like United up 60%. Delta Alaska up 60%. Delta and Alaska up 16%. Only airline of their size that's done anything close to Southwest is American, who is struggling still with their revenue issues, up 1% year over year. So I don't know. I just have a feeling that's not where they wanted to be a year later. They could have taken that same amount of money and put it in the S&P 500, and they'd make 4 times that return.
Yeah.
Of the 4% they made. Now, of course, they're not in it for just 1 year. They're in it for a longer term than that. But generally, these guys aren't in for 5 years. So I don't know. I think the market's saying you haven't shown us anything, and that's what I think is happening. And I don't know. It doesn't mean, of course, that it's not going to work eventually, and the steps they're putting in place won't make a difference. Or if they hadn't been there and they hadn't taken those steps, that Southwest wouldn't be even lower. I mean, I don't know that anybody knows the answer to any of those things. But what I know is, if you are a activist investor and you put billions of dollars into a company, you don't want it to do 1/4 of what the stock market has done over the same period. And that's where they are right now. So they've got some work to do.
Yeah, they do. They do. I actually think things could change real quickly here. It's going to be interesting to see third quarter financial results, right? Because the bag fees came in over the summer. We got a little glimpse of that, but that's going to be somewhat delayed by people who bought tickets before the bag fees started being imposed. That's going to go away, and we're going to start seeing seat assignment revenue start coming in. That's actually going to start happening in January or February or so. But if you're buying tickets now for January and February, you're faced with the choice of, am I going to buy a seat assignment at Southwest or buy an extra legroom seat. So some of that revenue may start showing up, and that could change. Now, if it doesn't show up, then that also answers the big question at Southwest. This is all dependent on Southwest generating a whole bunch more revenue, boosting earnings, getting that stock price up, and then Elliott cashing out. But I don't know.
My only counter to that is stocks, of course, trade on expectations, not on actuals. And anyway, while you may be right, and there'll be some huge surprise, what the market's telling us right now is they don't expect big improvements.
Right.
Or else the stock would be up already. It'd be up on those expectations. So,
right.
Like I say, they got some stuff to prove.
Yeah.
And as the investors, as the activist investors, they get a lot of work. They are underwater right now.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. A great point, and really curious to see what's going to happen this fall in the next year. One other bit of really important news I want to mention before we bring in Richard Anderson is that the Spirit Airlines bankruptcy reorganization is making some progress. Spirit's lawyers said in court that the company has a deal with existing bondholders for up to $475 million in new financing. We've talked about that before. A really crucial step. They had to have some new money coming in. Spirit also disclosed that under the deal, it worked out with leasing giant AerCap that Spirit's going to get $150 million out of that. So it's got some breathing room. Spirit got court approval to break 12 airport leases and 19 ground handling agreements. And Spirit asked the bankruptcy court to let it break leases on 87 aircraft, and return those planes to leasing companies by the end of this month, really fast. That's in addition, I believe, to the 27 aircraft that Spirit already agreed to return to AerCap. So Spirit will shed more than half of its fleet, 114 airplanes, and keep 100 Airbus A320 aircraft, which is about what it had in 2016 when Ben Baldanza ran Spirit. So basically, everything post-Ben gets wiped out in terms of size. Truly the lost decade. Probably makes sense since Ben had transformed Spirit into a money-making airline, and then things went off the rails when he left. I'm not saying that was Spirit's only problem by any means. I'm just saying it's kind of ironic. The moves should lower Spirit's cash burn dramatically, and that cash burn needs to come down dramatically because Spirit earlier disclosed that it expected to burn through $179 million in cash in the first month of its bankruptcy. The new cash raised won't last long at that rate, so vacating a bunch of airports, returning a whole lot of airplanes, and laying off employees, it's all a race against the cash clock. Now, what we really don't know is what Spirit's revenue is like these days. Are travelers still buying tickets? If they are, maybe it's 2016 all over again and Spirit can shrink to profitability. Any thoughts on Spirit, Doug?
Well, not on anything current, but I've been listening, to you, Scott, over the last several weeks as this has been transpiring, and I haven't been on through all this. I got a couple of comments on things I've heard. So first off, you gave a very passionate and well-spoken rant. I think was your own word.
Well, definitely passionate. Yeah,
it was passionate. It was well done, and I agreed with it about Spirit's communications as they did this and their communication with their customers and their team and what you thought they should have said instead. And I agree with you. I have a similar but more specific thing that rubbed me the wrong way, and that was I don't want to misquote them. I don't have it in front of me, but there was something to the effect that they sent to their team. The management did. The senior management sent to the team, and it said, every airline's done this. Mm-hmm. Very matter of fact. Kind of, this is just what happens if you run an airline. This always happens. Anyway. I can see maybe why they'd want to say that, but it is it's annoying to say the least. And I don't think it's right. I think it's failure to file bankruptcy for the management team, not for the team, not for the employees. But as a management team, you should be admitting failure. We're not going to be able to pay the people that we borrowed money from, all their money back. We're not going to be able to keep all you employed. This is failure. And you should admit it. And it's not true. Well, it may be true that individual airlines have all at some point, almost all of them have filed bankruptcy. It's not true of management teams. And, Bob Crandall, Herb Kelleher, Richard Anderson, who we're going to talk to, myself, name CEOs, almost virtually all of them have never filed bankruptcy. Generally, you file bankruptcy, you're gone. So at any rate, to suggest that this is, we're going through the car wash is, anyway, the reason it bothers me really, and I think we'll talk to Richard about this somewhat, is it perpetuates this myth that airlines aren't businesses and this is just what happens. And it's not true.
Yeah.
And you don't have to do things like this. And if you do as management, you fail. But Gerard Arpey resigned his CEO title at American because they were forced to file bankruptcy. He did that against the desires of his board because he knew, in Gerard's view, he had failed. And we can argue about whether that's true or not because he kept out a company while others had gone through. But nonetheless, that was his view. And that's how I think management should view this. And you shouldn't be off talking about, this is just par for the course, because it just perpetuates this myth that existed at one point in time, but we've worked really hard to correct that this is just business as usual, because it's not.
Right. And you're fooling your customers and your employees. And it's certainly not business as usual to file Chapter 11 twice in 11 months or 9 months or whatever it was. That's unprecedented.
Yeah, no kidding. So anyway, and then just one quick story from the vault for you, because you're when you were talking about before they filed about these credit card holdbacks. Triggered a story of mine that these credit card holdbacks back in 2009, early 2009, we're at U.S. Airways, and this is the Great Recession, and it's February, and cash flow is low, and it looks bad, and we at U.S. Airways, we have a meeting with the credit card processor. I think it was American Express. I'm pretty sure it was. They want to come in, and we're being told they want to talk to us about starting credit card holdbacks. Which, as you mentioned, that can be the start of some really bad things that happen because you have to disclose that, and others get worried. So this is really quite alarming to us, and we're getting ourselves all prepared for it. We get prepared for it. I'm there, Scott's there, Derek's there, some others. American Express shows up with just a lot more people than we thought, not just their relationship people. So we knew we were kind of in bad shape. As we go to start the meeting, just introductions. Our head of government affairs comes walking into the boardroom. Who's not supposed to be in this meeting. I wonder why he's there. He hands me, leans over, whispers in my ear, says, "My daughter just called me, and she says we have an airplane in the Hudson River."
Oh, my goodness.
I swear. That's how I find out. So, and the boardroom is, for us, that's the operations control room for senior management. That's where we're all supposed to report. So as he says this, I'm like, what? And I look outside, and I see, here comes our operations officers, and they're waiting to get in the room. So anyway, we quickly turn on the TV. We see it. It's actually on TV already.
Yeah.
And we tell the Amex people, I got to clear, well, before we turn the TV, but anyway, I say, we got to clear the room. We have an incident. They leave. Of course, it's national news within minutes. And anyway, so they all fly back to New York or wherever they came from. And they never gave us the credit card holdback because of 1549. And they told us later that if it weren't for that they were sent there to tell us and to not let us talk them out of putting in place a credit card holdback. We had all this great presentation about why we were going to be okay and you didn't need to do this. They were there to tell us that they were going to do it, and it didn't happen because of 1549. So it's one of the nice things that happened.
So
Sully's great.
So Sully saved the airplane and saved the company.
Yeah, I think we would have made it through. We proved we were on strong financial footing without them doing it. So I think we would have made it through. But we definitely would have had a credit card holdback, and that would have triggered some stuff that we didn't like. So yeah, he helped us a lot.
Yeah, we'll show you American Express. We're going to put an airplane in the river.
We did not do it on purpose. It was traumatic, but it turned out well. So.
Well,
that's my story for today.
Great story. All right, let's bring in Richard Anderson for many more great stories. Richard Anderson was a guest on Airlines Confidential in May, and listeners gobbled up his insights and analysis and stories. And we all wanted more. So how great for all of us when Richard reached out to Doug and thought of coming back and teaming up for an episode. So welcome back, Richard. It's a thrill to have you back on with us. Really looking forward to talking to you guys. You have such similar histories in some ways. You guys ended up at Northwest Airlines working together in the early 90s. I think Richard came to Northwest from Continental and Doug from American. And you both ended up CEOs of airlines, taking over right before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, Richard at Northwest and Doug at America West. So for those who didn't live through it, it was a terrifying time, not only for the magnitude of the lives lost and the horror that airlines had been used as weapons of mass destruction, but also fear in the industry that things were forever changed and companies and jobs might not survive. So I'd love to hear both of you talk about what that was like, being brand new to the CEO role and having this, the perhaps the biggest crisis in industry history. And you probably had to work together closely in ways that weren't normal as well. Tell us what it was like. Let's just start with Richard. What was it like for you after 9/11?
I guess I didn't really know what to do in the moment. So I still remember that morning. I was driving to work at Northwest and I got a call from Tim Rainey, who ran the SOC, and I dropped my kids off at school. And he said, when you get to the office, you got to turn the TV on. And it seems somewhat like a blur since then, but I still remember that first day about 10 that morning. Mickey Ferre, who was our CFO, who Doug worked for, I think, or worked with, Mickey came in my office and said, we've got to stop paying bills and we have to draw down all our credit lines. And so after grounding the fleet, because we knew the fleet needed to be grounded and we had airplanes spread over the Pacific, we grounded the fleet and then drew down the lines of credit and we quit paying our bills because we didn't know what was going to happen. And shortly thereafter, we knew we had to cut about a quarter of the capacity of the airline. And there were always some airplanes I wanted to retire. And so this was that opportunity. And then it was day to day, really, until Doug and I ended up together in DC. I think we spent days together in DC and testified together in front of both the House and the Senate for the aid package. It was kind of a long, tough recovery.
Yeah. Doug, as I recall, for you, America West was in pretty precarious shape.
Yes, we were. We were in more precarious shape than anybody. I became CEO on September 1st, and anyway, but we had. It's hard to imagine. It was back in the days where those days, a lot of, not all airlines, but a lot of airlines, would just try. You'd be working to make it through the winter when your cash would start building back, and all of a sudden, it's the winter, and we got no cash coming in. And in our case, we'd had some financing lined up to help us, supplier financing that fell apart, of course. So we were going to liquidate. Not just file Chapter 11. Our airline was going away. So anyway, it's a story I've told a lot, but we got through it thanks to work of Richard and others to get us the support we needed from the U.S. government as an industry, and we availed ourselves of the government loan guarantee program, which got us through and kept us around. So yeah, it was tough. But look, first off, Scott, thanks for having us, and thanks Richard for joining. I do this with Scott every 5 or 6 weeks or so. But I listened to your interview with Scott, and I told Scott, God, I wish I'd have done that with you, because well, one, I really enjoyed it, and we'll talk more about that. But as hopefully somebody told you, my view is, what you did, both at Northwest and Delta, is transformed our business, not just your airlines, but the business in numerous ways, but largely in just the way, you turned Delta into a real company that that did things real companies do, not things that airlines had done in the past. So we'll get more to that. But as to 9/11, Scott, Richard did more than he's saying. Because I remember Richard in those meetings. We called it ATA back then, but it was A4A now. The industry needed help getting secure again, and being able to be both something that was safe, but also could be reasonably efficient. And so we, as an industry, asked a triumvirate of people, Richard, Herb Kelleher, and Bob Baker, who was the COO of American, to go work with the U.S. government and develop what became the security systems that we put in place right after 9/11. Everything that you see now, none of it was in place. There were all sorts of ideas, many of which would have been just horrible, for the ability to process passengers. Herb in particular was really worried. Back then, Southwest didn't even give boarding passes. So he wasn't sure how he wasn't sure how he was going to get customers into the secure area because he had no way to prove that they had a ticket. So that's why Herb was there. Herb wasn't a huge operating guy, but he made certain he was on that task force with Richard and Bob, who understand operations really well, because Herb lived terrified that the big guys were always trying to figure out a way to put him out of business. And he trusted Richard and Bob that wouldn't do that, but he wanted to be there himself. So anyway, Richard, tell me about that anyway. Because I know while I was off trying to get my airline to be able to be solvent, you were actually helping the whole industry by making sure that we were able to put these plans in place.
Well, thanks for that, Doug, and thanks for those kind words. The interesting thing was American and United, since they were the victims directly of the 9/11 attacks, could not speak on behalf of the industry. And Leo Mullen at Delta really was not an operator. He didn't understand airport and airline operations. He was, really had come from banking and McKinsey. So it ended up being the three of us. And I was particularly engaged with her because we knew some taxes were coming. Remember that 9/11 spawned the creation of the TSA.
Right.
And we knew there were taxes coming on the industry. And depending upon what your business model was, different tax regimes could harm you more than the other. And so Herb at the time was still point to point, although subsequently became very much a hub and spoke carrier, in my view. And of course, the hub and spoke carriers like Northwest and America West, even at the time, we needed an equitable tax system. We needed the loan program. And there were compromises that had to be made. And we needed the grant program because the government shut our industry down. And then fourth, little known fact, we needed war risk insurance because we couldn't get war risk insurance, and you couldn't get back flying again without war risk insurance. And so that meant going to the White House and OMB. Mitch Daniels was the head of the OMB at the time. And we needed that not just for us, but we needed it for our fuel farms and vendors and the like. So it was those really key four issues. And the TSA, we were going to get the TSA whether we wanted to or not. And so it was just a matter of making sure that we saw as many of the policymakers as possible. I think Norm Mineta was the Secretary of Transportation at the time.
Yep.
Yeah, he was.
And Michael Jackson, wasn't it Michael Jackson, Doug?
Yeah.
Yeah. Michael Jackson was the deputy secretary who really made a lot of the policy decisions. And so we spent days in DC. And then ultimately, Doug, myself, Herb, and Fred Smith, and I think Leo Mullen, we all five of us ended up being on panels in the House and the Senate around the piece of legislation that Jim Oberstar sponsored in the House that created the airline relief program, the loan program. And, there was controversy around the loan program because candidly, Herb didn't want the loan program. He thought Doug and I, and we were a leveraged buyout still. So, we were better off, but, we had a lot of challenges at Northwest too. And we thought we'd need the loan program. So there was a little bit of a behind the scenes battle with Herb, who didn't want the loan program. because he thought that put Doug out. I mean, Herb was this wonderfully nice guy publicly, but he was tough and mean. And some people will be surprised to hear that. And look, I won the Wild Turkey Award one year. So Herb and I got along princely. I was actually from Texas. Herb was from New Jersey.
Right, right.
And so we got along well, but you had to have your instincts honed when you were around Herb, because he was so gregarious and nice, but boy, he knew how to push his agenda. So I think Doug and Inch, a lot of it was sort of trying to be a counterplay to Herb.
Yeah.
And there was a couple times. There was one time in particular we were meeting at ATA, and Herb got so mad at me, he swore at me and got up out of the room and left. I forget what the subject was. But we always were really good friends, even despite that. So I don't know. You kind of look back. I remember thinking at the time that we were not going to make it. This was too cataclysmic, and this was going to be, I was going to be a short-lived airline CEO, because what happened to the country was so cataclysmic that we just weren't going to be able to recover. So when you're that scared, you do your
Yeah.
best, right? You just get
Yeah.
up every day and go hammer away at it.
And it was definitely a different business when we came out of that. I mean, short haul flying went away. That affected Southwest profoundly, because people were getting in the car and driving. They weren't going through the security hassles and everything else. And I'm sure international flying suffered for a long time. And it's just a different business, a different attitude. I remember just a lot of the joy of flying had gone away for a while for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and again, part of a lot of it too, and again, Richard was really helpful in this and helping her. So much of that model was, particularly back then, was much more different than the rest of us. He needed quick connects and turning airplanes fast and all that. And if people were going to be waiting in long lines, it wasn't going to work. So
Yeah.
he was adamant about that. And it really, my recollection is we all look at it now as just what will be accepted. But I can't tell you how much fighting it took to stop things that would have been really horrific for the industry from being the security system. It's not like anybody loves the one we have now, but it's so much better than what, the people that didn't understand how airlines work wanted to do. The one I remember, it wasn't actually 9/11, it was a little bit later, but when the liquid ban came in, these guys, our government, what their plan was, they said, well, we can't, we're going to have to ban liquids over whatever, how many ounces. And we can't do anything about inside the secure area. So we're going to do secondary screening at the gate, to which I remember we told him, I said, you got to be kidding. It's like, we can't do a secondary screening at the gate. I said, if that's the solution, here's the solution the industry wants. You have to take liquids outside of the secure area. So that's a much better plan for our customers who are trying to take care of.
I remember
that. And they were just awestruck. They're like, well, we can't do that. That sounds horrible. People can't have water. It's like, well, I'm telling you, that's so much better than having them get. So anyway, they figured out a way to make sure all the liquids that were inside the secure area went through some bonding process, et cetera. But that's the kind of stuff that had to be fought through back then, and that Richard and Bob and Herb did.
So the question I really want to ask the two of you is, I've been studying airline history because I'm going to teach this class at the University of Colorado. And if you look at the industry post-deregulation, the 1980s were whack-a-mole. They're crazy. A lot of turbulence, a lot of failures and all that. The 1990s, there were startups. There, sort of became a global industry with open skies and things like that. But it wasn't really until you guys got hold of airlines and we had consolidation in the 2000s. You turned it into a business that could make money, and that hadn't happened before. So that's really what I want to talk about. How did you go about making this a normal business or at least less abnormal than other businesses.
Okay, cool. Let me take us back even further, Scott, because this will be fun for me. You know, Richard and I started we started at different places, Continental and American, but we ended up together at Northwest. Richard was higher than me in the organization. He was vice president. I think when I showed up, I was a director. We showed up in this headquarters. Anyway, this to me is symbolic of what we went through. That headquarters in Eagan, Minnesota, was, I think, built by Don Nyrop. Don Nyrop. Most of our listeners won't know, but this was deregulation area. What he cared about was cost. Everything, and he famously took the doors off the bathroom stalls so that people wouldn't sit in there and read. that was the headquarters. That was the headquarters that we moved into. And I remember a couple of things I want to ask Richard about. So first off, we were tasked with Ben and I came in as the two directors in finance, Ben financial analysis, me financial planning. And we were tasked with building what we had at American, which meant a lot of analysts, which Northwest didn't have back then. Make it a business.
None.
Yeah, and I inherited a finance department of like 3 people who were good people, but they were accountants. And we went and hired 30 MBAs, and we had to find office space for them. We just took over this space that people couldn't believe we were moving. It was arguably obnoxious, but we had to go do what we were being asked to do. Richard was doing similar things, in the legal department, and then moved on further. But anyway, part of what the symbolism of all this to me, Richard, I remember. You won't remember this, but I remember as I wasn't an officer yet. You were. The officers could park below ground. They had a heated garage. Yeah. The rest of us parked out in this, and it's freaking Minnesota, for God's sakes, and it's the middle of the winter, and your car, it's freezing outside, and it hurts to walk from your car to the indoors. I mean, some days it's 20 below, but Richard always parked outside, and I just thought, God, what a good guy, That's cool. He's one of us. He's a man of the people, He's out, which, by the way, is somewhat true. That's reasonably true. I think that's why he wanted to do it. Anyway, but then I got to be an officer. I got to park down in that garage. I did it one time. I said, well, I know why Richard doesn't do this. This is a pain in the We, of course, in that era, needed more vice presidents than Don Nyrop did. So you'd go down in that garage, and there weren't enough spaces. So all these vice presidents, you'd have to leave your keys in the car, and then so you could back everybody else out so you get your car out. It was just ridiculous. But they all did it, except me and Richard. We kept parking outside.
We kept parking outside.
So anyway, that's a story. That's a Richard story that I remember fondly, is seeing Richard walking inside with the rest of us in the freezing cold. But anyway, Richard, do you remember those days?
I do remember those days. And, I would say that NIROP and that era, the era that Doug and I took over from, I once had Donald Nyrop, who was legendary and was still alive when I was CEO. He was 90-something. And he told me that his generation didn't know what to do with deregulation. He said, I knew that I needed to move on. And as much as I was going to A4A meetings. Dasberg, who was the CEO of Northwest, for some reason took me to A4A meetings. You could bring one person, and I was very junior to a lot of people. But I got to know Herb and Fred Smith and Bob Crandall and Henson from US Air and Stephen Wolf from United. So I got to see that kind of layer. And that layer, candidly, didn't really know in some ways what to do with deregulation. Because, in 1983, for the first time, all domestic markets were open without pricing constraints and capacity constraints. And they really didn't know what to do. And I think that's where, what Doug did at Northwest was pretty remarkable, because at Northwest, we didn't know any numbers when I got there. And if you saw the organization he built, we had Robert Isom, we had Derek Kerr, we had Doug Parker, we had Jeff McClellan, we had Fred Cromer. He brought Holden Shannon. I know I'm missing other names, but if you look at that list of names, it sort of spawned a whole generation of financial thinking in the airline industry that wasn't there before and that you had to have going forward. Um, so I think it really started in some ways right there in Eagan, Minnesota. Um, and it was I officed right outside where Doug was, so the legal department in this, I think they built the building for $17 million, right? I mean, this was not what you would call it was classic Northwest. And I was right outside Doug's door, so I got to know Jeff and Ben Baldanza and Doug and a whole bunch of people that are still really, really good friends, like Robert Isom. And that's really, in a way, how the industry had to change. The industry was an industry that was sort of built on this sort of swashbuckling, aviation is a beautiful emotional thing. And no one made money and everybody was going bankrupt. And deregulation wrought a series of changes that the existing management in the industry did not know how to deal with.
So was there one key change that really did turn it into a business? Or was it a collection of changes? What was most important?
I would say consolidation.
Yeah.
Consolidation had to occur because remember that in the regulated era, the Civil Aeronautics Board regulated rates, routes, and services. There were the trunk carriers, which were American, United, and Eastern. And then everybody else was a regional. And a domestic carrier was not allowed to fly internationally because you had mandatory interline agreements, and there was Pan Am and TWA and Northwest. They were the international carriers. So it was this sort of completely make-believe economic system that made no economic sense. And remember, the Civil Aeronautics Board didn't know what a hub and spoke system was. The hub and spoke system grew out of a free market because you
Yeah.
needed the indivisibilities of a hub system so that everybody that got on the airplane in Oklahoma City to go to Doug's hub in DFW, you were serving 150 different destinations from Oklahoma City with one simple stop in DFW. That's all new post deregulation. But I'd say it had to have been consolidation because you had all these carriers grow up from the airmail route system when the industry was heavily subsidized. And just like I'm on the chairman of a railroad board right now, and we're going through a big merger to build a transcontinental railroad. And if you look at railroads, cell phone companies, airlines, they're network businesses, and network businesses have to have economies of scale, scope, and capture indivisibilities in a network. And so that was, in the end, key.
Yeah, no, I would absolutely agree, Scott. There were a number of problems. Consolidation didn't fix everything, but it was the key structural problem that existed, as we came out of 9/11. And airlines were struggling. There were just too many airlines trying to do the same thing. And in a business where scale matters and where customers actually want, an airline to be able to take them everywhere and not to have three different airlines for three different trips in the same month. And it was just, it was what we needed. So I remember it would drive me crazy in the early 2000s when people just kept talking about our business as if it's, we can't make money. All these quotes from, Warren Buffett about they should have shot down the Wright brothers. And you just ask yourself, what are you talking about? Why can't we have a business that makes money? People buy our product. There's demand for our product. We should be able to make this to where, that demand covers the cost of providing the service. And the biggest problem, again, was there were just too many of us trying to do the same thing. So as we consolidated, that fixed that structural problem. Certainly for the hub and spoke, there were too many hub and spoke carriers, I should say. There were, at the time, 7 of us, which is now 3. And that is a really competitive process. I know people, I'm sure some listeners think how consolidation was not good for the industry. I assure you it was. The industry couldn't have continued to function as it did. And it's still intensely competitive. And still, I sit on the board of Qantas. Qantas is 65% of the Australian seats flown. That's American, Delta, United added up today. 65%. So this is, what we have. Three, global hub and spoke airlines providing, some 2/3 of the seats in the system is really, really competitive still, but also efficient. Now you have three carriers that you can choose for global international service, as well as the other third of the market, which is either niche carriers or low cost carriers. So we had to fix that structural problem. There's much more to it, which we'll get to. I'm sure you'll get us to next, which is, and now having it structurally fixed, how do you run it as a business? Which Richard did better than anybody. But yeah, without consolidation, the things that followed couldn't have happened because we didn't have the structure in place to even be able to pay for those things.
It was an interesting concept. I remember writing a story back in the day that it was a good thing for travelers, for airlines to make money. And I got so much pushback from that. And our argument was, hey, they need to be able to buy new airplanes. They need to be able to cover their cost of capital. They need to be able to fix the seats when they're torn and need to be able to pay employees a decent wage and all of that stuff. And in the long run, it was good for travelers. But travelers, so many of them had really enjoyed when an airline loses money, it basically subsidizes your ticket, right? Somebody else is paying the cost, creditors or whoever. And so it was kind of a fascinating thing that, hey, here we are, airlines are trying to make money. That's not the end of the world for travelers. That's, in the long run, a good thing. But that was a new concept.
Yep.
Let's take a quick break to remind listeners that Airlines Confidential wouldn't exist without the support of our sponsors. Big thanks to Pratt & Whitney. At Pratt & Whitney, the pursuit of more sustainable aviation is foundational. For decades, Pratt & Whitney has been at the forefront of revolutionary advancements in aircraft propulsion technology. And by working smarter, cleaner, and greener today, they are committed to supporting the aviation industry in its goal of reaching net zero CO2 emissions by 2050. Learn more about Pratt & Whitney's smarter technology, cleaner fuel, and greener business at prattwhitney.com. In addition, thanks to Infinity Flight. As a proud partner of the American Airlines Cadet Academy, Infinity Flight delivers high-quality pilot training designed to meet the exacting standards of today's commercial airlines. Infinity Flight is building the next generation of airline pilots, focused, prepared, and ready for the flight deck. Learn more at infinityflight.com. Infinity Flight, the trusted choice of aspiring aviation professionals and the world's largest airlines. So talk more about transforming it into a money-making business. What happened? What were the keys to that?
Richard?
Yeah, so I think the first key was consolidation. And, Doug led that because America West to US Air was a really important step because the Department of Justice and the Department of Transportation, through many administrations, fundamentally opposed any consolidation. And the industry was really struggling. Doug was able to break through and get the US Air deal done, America West and US Air. A tough deal to do. And a lot of cost challenges given the revenue model. But that was a pretty seminal event.
It helped getting it through because US Airways was going to liquidate otherwise. So
Right. But I know, but that takes a lot of guts to take over an airline that's going to liquidate, right? I mean, it's not for the faint of heart. And that was the government's attitude. The only way you had consolidation was the failing carrier doctrine. So the only consented merger between 1987 and the Delta Northwest merger closed in whenever 2010, the only ones that occurred were either bankruptcy auctions, Eastern and Pan Am, and then Doug's transaction with US Air and America West, which started the ball rolling. We tried to do a transaction in 98 at Northwest. We bought David Bonderman's interest in Continental, and the Justice Department sued. And so everything kind of got put on a back burner. Oddly enough, if we would have gotten that transaction done, there'd probably be 4 hub and spoke carriers today, not 3.
Yeah.
But that's how the hand of government works. So consolidation was really important. And then the second piece of the equation was we had legacy costs. And so everybody had piled on debt from 1983 through bankruptcies, some bankruptcies, but everybody had piled on a lot of debt. We were all over levered. There were pension plans that couldn't be funded. And so the second piece of the equation was the restructuring process to get to what I'd call free market costs. So 2 steps: attack costs and consolidation.
Yeah.
Those were the 2 key steps to put the industry on the path to profitability. They were sort of the foundational steps that had to take place.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then customer service, and again, Richard, I'd like to hear more from you about this, because what you did at Delta, we can talk more about consolidation if you want, Scott, but what you did at Delta, once we got through consolidation, was then you transformed, you put in place a product that no other airline had ever seen before. And frankly, I think we all thought was impossible in terms of reliability first, and then, which then allowed you to do other things.
I was fortunate. I mean, I think there's probably one person that's probably not that well known who was pretty good at the airline business. He was the reason Doug and I worked together at Northwest, and that was John Dasberg. Daz was a pretty savvy guy, and he saw Doug Parker's capability, made him an officer. I think Doug and I were both officers at Northwest. We were 35 years old. Maybe even Doug was probably a little younger. And so, in that same vein, in '96, Dasberg slowly, starting in '94, kept moving me into operations. And so, my background was maintenance engineering and operations, not law anymore. And so, I always thought that if you could have just the right amount of capital to invest in the fleet. And I don't mean buying airplanes. I mean, actually, in my view, I'd rather have older airplanes than newer airplanes. My experience over time is new airplanes broke a lot more than old airplanes, because at least with old airplanes, you'd had enough time to be able to fix the system problems and the operating problems, and all your employees were completely familiar with those airplanes. And, this is the only industry in the world where you buy a piece of equipment for $60 million and it's your fault if it breaks. And
Yeah.
and so I just knew that if we solved the scale and scope problem with consolidation and we got our costs in line, then we could build a base product. I mean, a product we built at Delta was really foundational at Northwest. It's just we never had kind of the capital or the wherewithal to be able to do it, but we had that vision. And so once we got to Northwest and Delta together, and we had the network, and we had the cost structure, and we had enough capital, then you could go about building a business, a consumer business, because it's a consumer business. Um, you know, you could go about, from a maintenance and engineering standpoint, build an incredibly reliable operation. And it was just as simple. Doug, you may remember those meetings we had back at Northwest where Dasberg was always trying to find the base definition of the product. And he'd always say safe, clean, on time, with bags, and courteous service. So it's a pretty fundamental equation of product, but it's really hard to do. And
Yeah.
we set about doing it, and had a lot of really good people in the operation that, I'd grown up with over the years at Northwest, and I brought them all to Delta. And there were a lot of good people at Delta, and we brought in a lot of other good people, and we just kind of set about one step at a time building an operation where we didn't cancel flights and we ran on time and all the toilets worked and the interiors were well maintained and the airplanes all painted the same color and um, ran a schedule for convenience of the passengers. So it didn't have a lot of frills. I would say the one frill we did do was Delta had a big investment in seat back video, and we were thinking at Northwest that we should have individual seat back video. Um, and so we did make that. We made that investment. We made the Sky Priority investment, and we got GoGo to put Wi-Fi on the airplanes for essentially free. And that was basically the product. If we could deliver that product to every passenger every day on every flight, we figured we'd get a revenue premium. When I started at Delta, we had a revenue deficit per RASM, the industry RASM. We were about 15% behind because Delta had let a lot of consultants make a lot of decisions about product and pricing. Um, and they had been flying song around. It was not a good situation. And so we were at a 15% unit revenue deficit. And when I retired, we were plus 18.
Yep. Scott, I mean, we've had this conversation before. And it's easy to say what Richard just said, because everybody says it at some point.
Yeah.
It seems, it starts with it's safe, reliable service is what matters the most. These other things are add-ons. But it's another thing to do it. And Richard, on your last talk with Scott, you had a quote that just really resonated with me. I use it at the Qantas board, by the way. And it was, I'll screw it up and you can tell me exactly what it was, but it was something to the effect of, people think their product department is in marketing. It's actually in maintenance.
It is. People think product is in the marketing department, and it is not. Product is in technical operations and engineering.
Exactly. So honestly, I've heard so many people talk about this in so many boardrooms, and including myself. But that way of saying it is by far the best I've heard. Because what happens is everyone likes to say that, but they don't talk about. And then you end up talking about the output metrics like on-time performance and completion factor. And the input metric is you got to have the airplanes ready to go in the morning and staying in service all day long. Even saying all those words is too many for people to understand. And you end up in these boardrooms and you say that to somebody, but before too long, you're talking about the meals and the wine and the things that directors know about. But most airlines don't spend that much time in boardrooms talking about, aircraft availability at 7 a.m, which is much more important. So anyway, it's one thing to say it, how you guys did it. I remember when all of a sudden you guys were starting to have no cancellations, which is just unheard of in our business. Everyone would tell you that was impossible. And you guys just did it. And, I watched it. I wasn't there, but I know what that takes is an attitude that is so different than the way most airlines think. I'll give you an example, Scott. Every now and then, airplanes go hard down. They're out for weeks. Something happened to them. So now you're down a spare. Almost every airline in that case is going to go without a spare and preserve their schedule. If you want to have zero cancellations, you got to have an attitude that says, no, I'm going to cancel flights because the spare is required for us. And my example may not be perfect. One spare, you might try and fight through it. But that's what always happens. My point is what always happens is the scheduling department wins. And they win over the operating department. And they say, oh, no, the schedule's in place. You guys got to figure out a way to fly it. What Richard and Delta did is figure out a way that everybody wins. And anyway, tell me more about that, Richard. How do you get the mentality in place that zero cancellations is sacrosanct? And that's where we start.
Well, that you always have that tension in an airline between the scheduling and revenue department and the maintenance and engineering and operating department. So there's always going to be a tension there, and that tension, well managed and in a transparent way, is probably a good tension.
Right.
So we like that tension because the best way to schedule an airline was to run a really tight budget, clamp down on capacity in the annual operating plan. And then when you got into the year, open up the schedule so that you tried to get some variable capacity in the market. So you wanted that tension. But, we publish a level of ops in August of every year for the next year. And then we'd go through a 2 to 3 month planning process, which was laborious, and try to get those balances right. But then once you got in the operating year and you were making both operating investment and capital investment trade-offs, the marketing department would lose out to tech ops every time when we had to make a trade-off.
Mm-hmm.
And so, people, oh, well, we need to make this investment in advertising. No, how about we run a speed line on the 767, which has been giving us reliability problems. Let's take one airplane, let's take a line out of service this winter, and let's invest 2 million in that fleet. Let's bring every airplane in nose to tail and do a set of work on each one of them. And so when you shifted the allocation of resources, both operating resources and capital resources, to tech ops, and everybody saw that tech ops was the center of attention, which I always had an affinity for tech ops. My view of the airline was, whenever we made a decision, what's a mechanic on the second shift in the engine shop going to think about this? And when you run it from that perspective, I remember getting in huge discussions with folks over where we were going to spend our resource, because you don't have enough resource at an airline to do everything everybody wants. I used to always say every person at Delta Airlines knows where to spend $10,000 of capital and hire 2 more people. Well, if we did that, we'd be bankrupt, right? We can't triple the employment of the airline. So you've got to allocate your resources, and using the resource allocation to technical operations and the operation was really important. And you'd be surprised how often you just understood where constraints were in the operations. And I remember the biggest constraint, the biggest discovery we had was we were too cheap on line maintenance stations.
Yeah.
One of the keys to running a really reliable operation is a lot of line maintenance. Line maintenance stations don't cost a lot.
Right.
But when an airplane sits overnight, if you got the capture rate on a fleet up over 40% where it went to maintenance, you caught 40 to 45% of a fleet every night in maintenance, its reliability would go up when its MELs went down. So we just did a lot of that kind of work. And Steve Gorman, and Gil West and Bill Lynch, Mike Moore, there was just a crew of people that understood this and knew how to drive the performance of the airline through maintenance and engineering.
Yep. Well, look, it was transformational, and it's been transformational to the business. And most everybody's still trying to catch up, but they've all gotten a lot better. And anyway, my view, Scott, it really is because of what Richard brought to Delta, and showed that it could be done. I mean, honestly, the numbers we were seeing, I remember our team at American saying they must be cheating or something. They're not. These numbers can't be right, which wasn't true, of course. But it was just so much better than anyone had seen anywhere else in the business for an airline that size. And it transformed the whole business. So it made us all see, well, yeah, you can do this. I say, not everybody's gotten there. But
well, if you run the airline, if you have a philosophy and you drive it through the airline, that you run the airline for the customers, not for the operation. So there's one thing the industry does that we just stopped. And Doug, you'll know this. It's called a balance cancellation.
Right.
Right. Yeah. If you just abolish balance cancellations, and a balance cancellation is when you show up at the gate and you're flying from Atlanta to Hartford, and the airplane up in Hartford had a mechanical that was coming back to Atlanta, you would cancel the Atlanta to Hartford flight because you'll fix the one in Hartford and fly it back a few hours late, hopefully, and then you'll consolidate the Atlanta flight onto the next Atlanta Hartford flight. And that way you were running the operation for the convenience of the customers. I always had a great saying, which is somebody'd come up with some idea or we were doing something. I said, okay, you want to do that. How about you go over to one of the gates in Atlanta and explain it that way to all the passengers in the gate area?
Yeah.
And everybody got used to that. They knew that when they came into the Monroe room and we were going to go through an ops review, and we did these long ops reviews. It'd be 120 pages. We do them every month. And it was just, you would just grind through the operation and understand everything that had happened in the previous month. And somebody come up with an idea. I remember, Delta still has no denied boardings. Okay. And I remember the conversations about that. Our denied boarding numbers were really high. And I said, okay, let me get this straight. A person goes on our website and buys a ticket. They pay us right away. They do everything we tell them to do. They show up at the airport on time. They pay for parking. They check their bags. They get to the gate area. And then we tell them, well, the airplane's there, but we're not going to take you. Just think about that. And I said, why are we doing that? Why don't we just stop that? And they said, well, that'll be too expensive. And I said, well, it's a lot more expensive to your brand to tell that person did everything right, that they're not going to get to go. I said, why don't we just buy them all off? It actually ended up kind of paying for itself because the yield management system is constrained by denied boardings. Doug, you remember that, the RM systems,
Yeah.
the demand forecaster. If the demand forecaster is relatively unconstrained, you'll actually go out with more seats booked. And
Right.
and so over time, and the cost of denied boardings contra revenue. It's not an expense item. So anyway, I remember we had a long conversation about that, and I said, who wants to go over to the gate and tell half a dozen people that did everything right that they don't get to go today? And so that's how we ended up with no denied boardings.
Right. But and then what happens, of course, when you make decisions like that, is the airline gets better at those issues. So you guys, once you make that decision, for example, you'll stop overbooking the flights as much because now the cost of the overbooking is higher if you're going to pay everyone off, which makes you even better at forecasting, like you just said. The other thing is, what I know you all did is you got really good with technology on how to do this. So instead of waiting for the old method where you'd be on the airplane and they'd try to buy you off over the speaker, who wants to get off for $500, $600. What you all did before anybody was put in place a program where you get to the customer before they even got to the airport.
Right.
And certainly, even if they were at the airport, it'd be, through technology, or you'd be offering them. And look, that customer's happier. They've now,
Yeah.
they've now made their own choice and says, "Oh, this is great. Delta's going to give me $500, and they told me before I get here, and I'm just going to go 3 hours later." And it's just a dramatically better experience. And the whole airline gets better because of the simple decision that we're not going to do that anymore. And once you point that out to your team, that that's not what we do, that's not who we are, then they figure out ways to do things that that CEOs might not even have thought of.
Right. And your gate agent is happier because they don't have to
Precisely.
deal with all the angry customers, and everybody else is happier because the flight probably got out on time and won't be late the rest of the day and for the next four flights.
But anyway, my point is, Richard, when he told that story, didn't mention any of those things, even though it's true, because that wasn't the impetus for doing it. The impetus was, it doesn't seem right to our customer. I don't want to be the person that tells them that. But when you make these kind of decisions, the mandates really, people figure out how to do things a lot better. And the airline gets more efficient.
Yeah. All right, I want to look forward a little bit too while we got you. What do you guys see in the industry today? And a lot of the discussion is about the discount sector and the troubles that the discount sector has had. Do you think we have the competition that we need out of the big four? How do you view future airline competition in the U.S.?
Look, when we talked about like the hub and spoke carriers, I think we talked about this. I don't think between United, Delta, and American, that's a intensely competitive part of the business. The hub and spoke carrier, maybe one day, if allowed, a JetBlue or Alaska consolidating into one of those might happen. But the transformative work's already done on the hub and spoke carriers, the big transformative work. What you're seeing in the discount carriers is that work wasn't done yet. And maybe it never will be. Maybe there will always be some, startups, because the startups actually can have lower cost. But anyway, that's what I think is going on now. You're seeing a couple of things have happened. One, and we don't have enough time for this, but my own view is basic economy, again, back to Delta, the basic economy is so transformative. And then the sell-ups from there, which we now call premium traffic. But we've created a way to have people pay a premium. But the real point is basic economy is matching these fares that we couldn't match in the past. We'd match them, but then we'd yield manage them, and they'd get a lot of spill. That goes away with basic economy. So their model is hurt. And their model also gets hurt a lot by their costs. Once you get, it's a startup cost structure that requires growth. And if you can't grow anymore, which is hard to do, largely because of basic economy, they have trouble. So they got to figure out a way to make their model have a cost advantage again for it to work, because they're not going to have not going to have an enormous price advantage. They need to figure out, what Herb figured out early on, what Ben figured out, how to compete with the large carriers by having a significant cost advantage, and they've lost that. So that's what I think, and I think anyway, I don't know who ends up winning that, but I think there will always be a kind of ultra low cost model in the business. I don't know who it's going to be, but it's going to be it's going to be an ultra low cost model, not a I'm going to be like them and try and get the same revenues they have, because they can't compete. They just don't have the scale. They don't have the hub and spoke structure. So, but I also don't think that's a huge deal. I mean, I know it's really important for those airlines and the people that work at those airlines. But if you just globally, if you think about the airline business, the number of seats keeps growing, demand for travel keeps growing. Airlines keep getting better at reliability, absent enormous constraints like an air traffic control system that can't handle it. But within those constraints, the airlines, I think, are doing a better job of customer service. I'm actually really bullish on the industry, U.S. and globally, just because I think demand for air travel is going to continue to grow. And there's no better way to meet that demand than jets. And there's no better way to meet that demand than a hub and spoke system. That is the most efficient way to get people from one remote point to another remote point. Richard?
First, from an American consumer standpoint or an international consumer standpoint, the markets are quite contestable in that when you look at real fares adjusted for inflation since 78, there's probably no better bargain for the U.S. consumer. And, that data has remained relatively unchanged in terms of when you compare real airfares today. By the way, you need to take out all the taxes. Let's look at the fare that you're paying the carrier, not the extra 28% you pay the federal government. It's an incredible success story for deregulation. So I don't think the contestability has changed at all. Second, to Doug's point, I think there's a great opportunity for low-cost carriers because American, United, and Delta have created such a huge cost umbrella. And their costs are really high. I mean, I would have never thought that you could pay a wide-body pilot $650,000 a year and have a profitable business. But they do. But that also creates a high umbrella that, a well-run, low-cost carrier ought to be able to penetrate. Now, I'd say the only thing that's made it tougher is, the pilot issues with the 1,500-hour rule has, created some barrier. But I think those barriers are going away. So I agree with Doug. I think that the marketplace has been phenomenally successful. Alliances, and the ability to connect traffic around the world has created incredible opportunities for consumers in the US. So great policy decision by Jimmy Carter and Senator Ted Kennedy back in 78,
Yep.
because it's been a real success.
Yeah. And so do you think there's room for startups these days?
I do think there's room for startups. What really ought to happen, though, is there ought to be, to Doug's point, what the market's telling us is if you're a low cost carrier, you really do need to have some scale, right? You got to have some scale. And the most amazing application of federal antitrust law was this federal judge somewhere that said, was it Spirit and Frontier?
Spirit and JetBlue, the judge in Boston.
Spirit and JetBlue couldn't merge. Amazing,
Yeah.
amazing. Okay, I mean,
Yep.
I would guess that American, United, and Delta were all kind of secretly snickering, because everybody knew what was going to happen at Spirit at that moment in time, and the only good thing they have going for them is that two people that Doug trained are running Spirit, and the COO worked for me at Northwest. But Fred Cromer was one of those great MBAs that Doug hired at
Yep.
Northwest. He's the CFO, and the CEO's Dave Davis, who you recruited and worked for you at Northwest, and probably, I think, one of the best COOs in the industry has been to ride us at Spirit. So if anybody's going to pull it out, it'll be those guys. But it's always interesting to see a federal judge in Boston make a decision like that leads to a double bankruptcy of Spirit.
I've had several listeners ask for more ideas on how to fix Spirit, because we have a lot of talk on, it's the difficulty that Spirit is going to have trying to find a model that works. Do you guys see things that Spirit should do that would fix Spirit?
Merge with Frontier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think they've reached a problem, which I think they know. They can't grow 20% a year anymore, which was keeping their costs down.
They're shrinking 50% right now.
Precisely, and they can't get their costs down. So they have a serious problem, a structural problem of an ultra low cost carrier that doesn't have ultra low costs. And so, at any rate, look, it feels like you're going to wind us down, Scott. One thing, if we do, but one thing I wanted to talk to Richard about when we were going through consolidation. So this is, I'm sure, overly focused on what I know about what we did, but Richard, I take some credit for you doing all the work you did for Delta and therefore our industry, because when we went through the consolidation story, we left out the part where we had done the U.S. Airways America West merger, and then we decided we were going to go make a hostile for Delta, which failed famously because Jerry Grinstein went and got the Delta team rallied against us and keep Delta my Delta, and that whole campaign.
Yeah.
Took place to fend us off. A great lesson for me. It's how we got the American deal done, frankly, because what we learned is don't just listen to the investment bankers that tell you if you have a better plan in bankruptcy. If it's worth a quarter more to the creditors, they're going to take your plan over the other one. We had a much better plan, but of course they were getting stock, and they didn't want to have stock in a company where the employees didn't want to have a management change. So. Anyway, that happened. A lesson learned for us, but also they changed their standalone plan. They changed the Delta standalone plan. Jerry was planning to come out as CEO, and either I don't know what his plans were, but it was a competition between Ed Bastian and Jim Whitehurst as to who was going to be CEO. But the creditors nixed that, and instead, Richard Anderson was named CEO of Delta as Delta emerged from bankruptcy. So anyway, that's the story as I remember it. You were at United Healthcare. What do you think would have happened if we hadn't done that?
Well,
hostile attempt.
Yeah, the creditors committee was very much in charge of that bankruptcy. And that's how they called me to be on the board of directors and had asked me to be chairman of Delta.
Right.
And I was busy at United Health Group. So I said, no, I couldn't be chairman, but I could be on the board. And so I interviewed with the creditors committee. But little known to everybody, I'd been pretty close to Jerry Grinstein even before all that happened, because we had the Falcon Alliance, which was the alliance among Continental, Delta, and Northwest, which was a domestic alliance that was the outgrowth of settling the golden share we owned in Continental, or
Yep.
settling our relationship with Continental, because we had owned a controlling interest in Continental. Anyway, we set about that, and I got to be good buddies with Jerry as part of implementing the Falcon, what we called the Falcon Alliance domestically. So I'd made a lot of trips to Atlanta. We'd meet sort of covertly in different places so that people wouldn't speculate. But we had stayed in touch regularly during my time at United Health Group. So, I would say that the creditors committee was very much in charge. I wasn't very close to the keep my Delta, but I think I got a lot of the benefit of it because there was a good spirited. What you really did was rally the troops for us. So thank you for that, Doug.
I'm glad I could play a part. Anyway,
but more than that, I mean, it really shook up Delta, and it was not long after that Richard ends up CEO of Delta, and the Delta Northwest merger came 2 years after yours. I mean, I don't know, Doug. It seems to me like you really stirred the pot at Delta and eventually set those changes in place.
Okay, well, good. Anyway, we all turned out fine. It's great. So anyway, it makes me feel a little better, because again, I really, Richard, I'm proud of what you did for our industry today. And I know what you did. I know you did it for the Delta shareholders and Delta team, but you transformed the industry in a way that's really important. What I said when you weren't when I talked to Scott about your interview, which is, if you think about the most transformational CEOs since deregulation, for me, it's Herb Kelleher, Bob Crandall, and Richard Anderson. Others, Gordon transformed Continental and did a fantastic job. But what I'm talking about is, what Bob did post deregulation and what Herb did. And then what you did, I think, is right there. So if I had anything to do with that, I'm happy about it because our industry is better for it.
Well, Doug, you're very kind to say that, but I think we ran a parallel path that started in Eagan, Minnesota. I still remember, I got a picture in my mind of the memo from Dasburg announcing you and Ben Baldanza and Jeff McClellan joining Northwest Airlines. And I think it kind of started there. And, in a way, you were probably a lot better off being able to merge US Air and American in the end than, a hostile at Delta. Because in
Definitely.
the end, it ended up being, you learned a lot and you did an incredible job being able to pull off that merger. I really did think, though, that once we got our deal done, and remember, the Delta Northwest merger had no objection from DOJ. I knew that, and that was probably because I was on one side and Doug Steenland was on the other, who's the all-time great lawyer. That once we got ours done, everybody else was going to get to do one.
Yeah.
Well, they sued us.
They did. They sued, and United ended up, I think, in a lawsuit too. But in the end, with Continental, for sure, they ended up in a private lawsuit that they had a trial over.
Mm-hmm.
But I think they had to divest a bunch of slots in Newark. We didn't have to divest anything. And I knew once we got ours done, we needed to consolidate and get a single operating certificate as fast as possible, because it was not going to be long before the other two big mergers occurred. And you did it. You did it, being able to pull that off and do the deal that you did was really remarkable.
Yeah, well, thanks. Anyway, I think the industry's better off, I guess, in summary on all this, Scott. I know you're teaching a class on airline history coming up, and this is a good bit of it. This post-regulation stuff is really transformed the business. People like Richard deserve all the credit for it, and those of us that are beneficiaries of it should be appreciative.
Well, anybody who travels has benefited from it. And, I think you have both done so much to transform the industry. It's a really special thing to get to talk through all this stuff. I really appreciate it. I hope listeners appreciate it too. But thank you both. Thank you both for all your insights, the stories, the reminiscences, and also the outlook for what's ahead. It's been very helpful. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. And maybe Doug and I can come in person and teach at your class.
That would be great. we would love that. Let's plan on it. I'll put it on the syllabus.
All right.
All right.
There.
Thank you both very much. We will be right back with more on Airlines Confidential.
Promotional consideration provided by thearchive.net, celebrating 20 years with a fresh new look and over 60,000 items of AvGeek goodness. It's the hub of air transport history, and you're welcome aboard. Thearchive.net.
Thanks again to Richard, and thanks too to our sponsors, especially Cirium. Cirium offers the most accurate and precise data and analytics to enable airlines to optimize planning, operations, and passenger services. The right intelligence drives operational efficiencies, enables you to predict market shifts, and helps airlines respond quickly to maximize revenue, manage costs, and seize commercial opportunity. Visit Cirium.com for more. And of course, thanks to Ontario International Airport for its support. Faster is always better when it comes to traveling in and out of Southern California. That's why a growing number of travelers are choosing Ontario International Airport. With quick freeway access, easy parking, and shorter lines, J.D. Power surveys consistently rank Ontario the most popular mid-sized airport in California. Visit flyontario.com to learn more about ONT and how they boldly seize every opportunity to connect the Inland Empire to the world. Doug, I feel like we made aviation history today. Thanks so much for helping set this up. I hope listeners appreciated the opportunity to hear you guys interact and learn from the two of you and who have been absolute best at running airlines. This was a real treat today. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, thank you. I enjoyed it. I always enjoy talking to Richard, and I like that too. So thanks so much.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll be back next week with Christina Custodes and her brand new $1.57 billion terminal in Pittsburgh. Christina will be cutting the ribbon this weekend and then bringing some of the architects who worked on the project to Airlines Confidential. So it should be a fun conversation then. Have a great week, everyone, and we'll be back with more next week.
This podcast is produced by Mass Media. Info@massmedia.net.